Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
After the shock of the general election result, Theresa May has spent the weekend attempting to steady the ship, maybe even just keep it afloat, reappointing key figures to the cabinet, sacking her two closest aides, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, after Conservative MPs demanded their removal in the aftermath of the Conservatives' failure to win an overall majority in the House of Commons. Over the next hour and a bit, we'll continue to take stock of the remarkable events of the last 72 hours and try to work out where we go from here. First, though, here's Anna Fleming with a reminder of the high-octane drama of Thursday night.
Well, I was going to say, this chair is quite warm. Has someone just been in it? Michael Fallon's bum was on this chair. Right.
Bums on seats, it's election night at the BBC, hosted, as always, by David Dimbleby.
This is David Dimbleby's actual seat. Look. He's got 4 pencils, a stopwatch, and a calculator. It's pretty low tech, isn't it?
Showtime. And what a show.
And what we're saying is the Conservatives are the largest party. Note, they don't have an overall majority at this stage. 314 for the Conservatives. That's down 17. 266 for Labour. That's
yes, me, 34. Speechless. Luckily, there were plenty of politicians who never are.
What does this exit poll actually mean?
Well, if it's accurate, it means that Theresa May has just presided over the greatest catastrophe that I can think of in the Conservative Party's history.
We haven't seen a seat change hands, and we're hearing about possible Conservative gains in the Midlands and losses in London. What would you have to say?
And the people write PhDs about the 2017 election for the next 25 years.
Labour candidates were winning in unexpected places. Tories were losing in unexpected places, including 8 members of the government, like Treasury Minister Jane Ellison in Battersea. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd held on in Hastings, just.
Okay, the former Deputy Prime Minister and former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, has been beaten in Sheffield Hallam.
I've always sought to stand by the liberal values I believe in, but I, of course, have encountered this evening something that many people have encountered before tonight, and I suspect many people will encounter after tonight, which is in politics. You live by the sword and you die by the sword.
Lib Dem leader Tim Farron was narrowly re-elected in Cumbria, unlike the SNP's Westminster leader Angus Robertson, who lost his seat. Former First Minister Alex Salmond defeated 2.
The Scottish National Party have lost very fine parliamentarians this evening, and that is a grievous blow to the SNP. But overall, the results in Scotland show the SNP will have won a majority of the seats in this country and a majority of the votes.
Paul Nuttall failed to get elected in Skegness and resigned as UKIP leader.
So the Green Room looking a bit ruined. A bit like UKIP maybe looks tonight?
Empty. No, absolutely not. I think we're doing better than the SNP. No, look, this is kind of expected. We deliberately didn't stand in some seats to try and give Brexit candidates a free run. I think it's quite interesting that the main leading Brexit candidates in this election are getting their seats back. You know, Paul's
Right, it's dawn in the real world, and I found a pub that's been open all night and is still open. What state are they going to be in there?
And was it young people who'd seen Corbyn, voted and got the T-shirt who helped the Labour leader to exceed expectations?
Right, 5:05 in the morning, we're outside Jeremy Corbyn's house in Islington in North London. Surprisingly small press pack for the man who's destroyed Theresa May's electoral strategy. Jeremy, are you asleep?
If there is a message from tonight's result is this: The Prime Minister called the election because she wanted a mandate. Well, the mandate she's got is lost Conservative seats, lost votes, lost support and lost confidence. I would have thought that's enough to go, actually, and make way for a government that will be truly representative of all of the people of this country.
Theresa May did the opposite, popping to the palace, then forming a government, with a bit of help.
What the country needs more than ever is certainty. And having secured the largest number of votes and the greatest number of seats in the general election, it is clear that only the Conservative and Unionist Party has the legitimacy and ability to provide that certainty by commanding a majority in the House of Commons. As we do, we will continue to work with our friends and allies in the Democratic Unionist Party in particular.
Well, 15 hours after election night started, it's all over. What happens next? Who knows? Good night.
That's our Adam reporting there. With me, three seasoned political journalists, the Sun's political editor, Tom Newton-Dunn, Steve Richards, who writes for The Independent, Julia Hartley-Brewer, who presents her own weekday show on Talk Radio. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with what's just happened, then look forward to what might happen. Julia, why did it go so wrong for the Conservatives?
Well, you can't run a presidential campaign if you've got a candidate that's got the charisma of this desk. In fact, probably less charisma than this desk. The reality is, if you're not going to put her out in debates, if she's not going to be, just coming to the people and selling herself, which she absolutely studiously didn't do, then you can't run that sort of campaign. And there is a possibility maybe another leader could have just walked that with a 100 majority against Jeremy Corbyn. Another campaign, we'll never know, could perhaps have actually delivered at least a majority of, say, 30 or 40, and certainly not a coalition with or deal with the DUP. We'll never know. But fundamentally, wrong to call the election at this time, wrong to run the campaign they did, and perhaps the wrong candidate.
A huge setback for the Conservatives, a particular huge setback for Mrs May, but the third election in a row in which Labour has failed to win.
It was still a substantial historic achievement for Jeremy Corbyn. If you consider the context in which this election was called, Theresa May on her honeymoon to die for politically, with Labour voters split over Brexit, suddenly calling an election when most Labour MPs weren't willing to cooperate with whatever campaign was being held by Labour, for them to do as well as they done is an extraordinary achievement.
They got no more seats than Gordon Brown in 2010, or roughly the same.
The context could not have been more daunting, and to wipe out a majority of this figure who 6 weeks ago was walking on water and appeared to have Brexit as part of her ammunition against this split Labour vote, it remains astonishing. And one of the errors she made, and so many others made, probably all of us, was to underestimate the potency of Corbyn and that relatively modest social democratic manifesto.
Does it not take a stupidity bordering on genius to turn a 20-point lead at the start of the campaign into a hung parliament?
Yes, it does, and it did. And that's what happened. I think that lead was soft, largely because Theresa May was unknown. We know Theresa May because we've been lunching her and interviewing her, or you have for years on end. The public didn't. The public got to know her and discovered she was a Maybot. But I still wouldn't... The Maybot. I mean, that is going to be the term that's going to stick forever from this campaign. However, the greatest mistake of all, I think, she made, I differ to my two colleagues here, it wasn't the amazing rise of Corbyn or putting up a Maybot who's supposed to be president. It was a complete failure to remember that people wanted a revolution when they voted for Brexit, and she came across as the party or the candidate of continuity.
And of small c Conservative. All right, so as things stand now, we are where we are. Mrs May trying to put together a government. Where do we go from here?
Well, I have to say I was on College Green along with you on the early hours of Friday morning, and I have to say I didn't see anybody that day who didn't say, well, see you back here in October. Nobody,
second election,
nobody, I mean, good God forbid nobody wants a second election, but I just simply cannot see the Tories being able to stay in power with the DUP. I'm personally very unhappy with a lot of the DUP policies, where their stances on gay rights, capital punishment, abortion rights, and there'll be an awful lot of people who are sort of floating voters who will just go, recoil in horror at that even unofficial alliance.
I get the sense Mr. Corbyn may be up for a second election as quick as it comes. I don't get that impression from the Tories.
I'm sure he is, and if there were one, he might well win it, which is why there won't be. All logic, as Julie suggests, points to another election. I don't think there will be one, because I don't think any Conservative Prime Minister will feel strong enough and confident enough to hold one, not least after the trauma of this one. They'd have to be about 50 points ahead in the polls to take the risk. And so I think, rather like 74 to 79, we're going to have this fragile House of Commons with a minority government for quite a long time, simply because whoever's Prime Minister won't have the confidence to call an election.
So the Tory fear of a quick second election could well result in them going more leniently on Mrs May than they really want to.
We've seen it already. Mrs May is still Prime Minister. Mrs May has not yet tendered her resignation. That would have happened by now if they thought they could win a second snap general election and if they had a candidate. So that's 100% why she's in power. I think they will stabilise. They're also desperate to get Brexit negotiations underway, by the way. That's another reason why she's still there, because she is the one who needs to pull that trigger, and most of the Tory party are aching to have that trigger pulled. Once that's pulled, once they've stabilised the ship, and once Jeremy Corbyn is back in the House of Commons, where he's not very good, let's remember, I think they may have another crack.
We have lots more to talk about, so let's move on. It's good to have you with me here in this open air, my Westminster penthouse, open to the world.
On holiday.
Waiting for the PIMs.
I just can't find the cocktail bar. Anyway, it's early. Let's take a look at the election result in a little more detail. Here's how the parties fared in the election on Thursday. And here's how they got on in the previous general election in 2015. Now, as you can see, the Labour vote is up dramatically by 10 points. But the Conservative vote also rose quite significantly by 5 points. The SNP and the Liberal Democrats both saw declines in their support. And UKIP's vote has almost completely collapsed from 13% in 2015 to just 2% this time around. So the resurgence of the two-party politics is one of the key trends from this election. The combined vote share of the two main parties is now 82%, more if you exclude Northern Ireland. It's the highest it's been since the election of 1970, when Mr Wilson and Mr Heath battled it out. That's partly explained by the collapse of UKIP. According to one estimate, the Conservatives may have got 50% of 2015 UKIP voters on Thursday. It's also thought that last year's EU referendum has helped to polarise support along more traditional Labour and Conservative lines. In polls carried out before the election, it was estimated that 50% of Remain voters supported Labour, nearly two-thirds of Leave voters supported the Conservatives. There's also speculation that a rise in the number of young voters may be behind the boost in Labour's support, but we don't yet have reliable figures on that. We hope to get it later this week. But it is notable that Labour did well in certain constituencies with youthful populations. For example, it's thought that the large number of students in Canterbury helped Labour win the seat for the first time ever, with a 9% swing from the Conservatives. The two main parties have also seen changes in their number of seats. Labour lost 6 seats but gained 36, giving them a net gain of 30 seats. Most of those Labour gains were in England, where the party took 27 seats, mainly from the Conservatives. They also gained 3 seats in Wales and 6 in Scotland from the SNP. As for the Conservatives, they lost a total of 33 seats, but also gained 20, giving them a net loss of 13 seats. Most of those 20 Conservative gains came in Scotland, where the party took 12 seats from the SNP, meaning that it's the Scottish Tories that are allowing Mrs May to form a government, or try to this week. Who would have thunk that? In England, the Conservatives gained just 8 seats. Joining me now from Glasgow is the brains behind Thursday night's astoundingly accurate exit poll. I, of course, was always sure it would be never anything but accurate. Here is Professor John Curtis joining us. Now, John, the Tories saw a 5-point rise in their share of the vote to 42%, very high by recent historical standards, but they still lost over a dozen seats. Why?
Well, the truth is that under our first-past-the-post electoral system, the share of the vote that you get is almost irrelevant. What is crucial is how you do relative to your opponents. And in particular, so far as Conservative and Labour are concerned, the principal statistic that determines their fate is the gap between them. Now, the truth is that in the 2015 election, the Conservatives had a 7-point lead. That only got them a majority of 12. And somebody should have said to the Prime Minister before she pulled the trigger, you do realise, Prime Minister, you do have to be a very long way ahead of the Labour Party in order to increase your majority. Yes, the opinion polls say you're at that point now, but if they fall very much, you might be in trouble. Well, in the end, the Conservative lead is actually 2.5 points, and 2.5 points these days is not enough to secure an overall majority, given that Northern Ireland is out of the frame. Scotland, although there are still fewer SNP MPs, it still has a majority of third-party MPs, and there are still Liberal Democrats and Greens. So although you're right to point out that in terms of the share of the vote, there are, this now looks like a two-party race once again. We've still got 62 third-party MPs in the House of Commons, which is much more than in 1970. That makes a hung parliament more likely. Meanwhile, there weren't that many marginal seats that the Conservatives were going to pick up in the first place. So we shouldn't be surprised. It's the relative standing of the parties that's crucial, not their absolute levels of support.
And John, how do we explain the 10% rise in Labour's share of the vote? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of a youth surge.
Yep.
And I'd like to know if we can nail that down, but also were there other swings too? I mean, were some Green voters moved to Labour, Liberal Democrats, even perhaps some UKIP voters moved to Labour? What do we know?
Well, I think we can probably pick out three crucial patterns. The first is that a lot of people who at the beginning of the election campaign said, well, yeah, I usually vote Labour, but you know, I can't imagine doing so under Jeremy Corbyn. He's so hopeless. Because of his relatively strong performance in the election campaign, they came back into the fold. So that by the time we got to polling day, there were as many 2015 Labour voters who said they were going to vote Labour again as there were 2015 Conservative voters who said they were going to vote Conservative again. So that was crucial point number one, getting the faithful back on board. Second, yes, it's certainly clear that there was a substantial swing to young voters during the campaign. Labour started off relatively strong in that group, with around 40–45% support, but the opinion polls had it up at around 60–65% by the time the election came. Now, you're right to say we don't know exactly about the turnout amongst younger people who are less likely to vote, but certainly the pattern of the results suggests that the turnout was going up more in places where there were more young people, so probably somewhat more of them did manage to turn out and vote. The third crucial pattern is that this was an election which to some degree voters did polarize around the issue of whether shape of Brexit, whether you remain or a leave voter. In the end, the Conservative vote during the course of the campaign increased amongst leave voters but declined amongst remain voters, and Labour's progress during the campaign was disproportionately amongst remain voters. So although the parties may be thought to be not that far apart on the shape of Brexit, they seem to have been sufficiently far apart that Labour was rather more attractive for those who were less keen on the kind of Brexit that Theresa May had in mind.
John Curtis in Glasgow, thank you very much as always. We're now going to Salford, where we're joined by the chairman of the Conservative Backbench 1922 committee, the sort of chief shop steward of Tory backbenchers, Graham Brady. Graham Brady, you think Mrs May should soldier on. Why?
Well, there's no other party that is in a position to form a government. Clearly, these aren't the circumstances that either the Prime Minister or I or any of my colleagues would have wanted to be dealing with at the moment, but they are the circumstances that the electorate has presented us with. And I think it's our duty to make the best of that. It's our duty to try to offer government as resilient as it can be in quite difficult times.
But is she ever going to be more than a caretaker leader now?
Well, I think one of the odd things about the experience of the last 12 months is that Theresa May, I think, had performed very well as Prime Minister, and the public rather liked her as Prime Minister. I think few people would say that the campaign succeeded in projecting her qualities as strongly as it could and should have done. So as we return to government, albeit in difficult circumstances and dependent on support from other parties, I think we will see people once again seeing the steady, calm, thoughtful Theresa May as Prime Minister.
Do you fear that a leadership election might lead to a second general election And that prospect terrifies you, doesn't it?
I'm not sitting here terrified, Andrew, but I think that there is zero appetite amongst the public for another general election at the moment, and I don't detect any great appetite amongst my colleagues for presenting the public with a massive additional dose of uncertainty by getting involved in a rather self-indulgent Conservative Party internal election campaign.
That's because they're frightened they might lose. That's why they don't want another election.
I think I have a slightly higher view of my colleagues than perhaps you do, Andrew. I think most of us are motivated by a belief in the national interest and are responsible people who want to try to offer that responsible, steady government, especially at this point, as we know, just a matter of days until those important negotiations on leaving the European Union begin. It's a time when we need experience, it's a time when we need responsible people in government, and I think it's our duty to try to offer that.
Many Tories have said to me, some of them pretty senior, that Mrs May must never be allowed to lead your party into another general election. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I think these are judgments that will be made in the fullness of time by the Prime Minister and obviously by colleagues, as is always the case with any Prime Minister, any leader of the party. But at the moment, we are, I think, resolutely focused on trying to make sure that the country can have the responsible, steady government that it really needs at this point, and that should be our focus too.
In what way should Mrs May change?
I think there are all sorts of lessons that we can pick up from the campaign, from the reaction to it, even from the thing that surprised perhaps most of us, most especially, the way in which Jeremy Corbyn, in spite of all his manifest failings and particularly his extreme political views, was able to present himself in a sort of rather avuncular way.
But I didn't ask about Mr Corbyn. In what way should the Prime Minister change?
I'm saying I think there are some lessons there. I think in terms of relaxing a little bit into communicating with the electorate. It's something she does very well in person, I think, increasingly so since she became Prime Minister. But that wasn't coming across...
That's not the experience of the campaign, Graham Brady. The more
that's
people
exactly
saw
what I was
of her,
about to say, Andrew.
The more people saw of her, the more they didn't like the cut of her jib.
That's exactly what I was going to go on to say. That didn't communicate in the campaign, and that's something clearly needs to communicate. But also, I think there's no doubt we need to see a much more open and inclusive approach within government, within Parliament as well, and that's not just a kind of a desirable outcome, which I think always would have been desirable, and I've had this conversation with previous Prime Ministers as well. It's an absolute necessity in these circumstances. Trying to make a hung Parliament, a minority government work, I think really requires a much more inclusive approach, bringing people into the decision-making process.
Well, are you being brought into the decision-taking process on the deal that's being done with the DUP?
Well, one of the things that I've said to the Prime Minister, I think it's very important she speaks to colleagues as soon as possible. We were going to have a meeting of the 1922 Committee on Tuesday. I'm hoping to bring that forward to tomorrow now so that she can come and talk to
But are you being involved as the chief shop steward for Tory backbenchers? Are you involved in this more inclusive process or not?
I'm not on a negotiating team, but I saw the Prime Minister very early after the election had taken place. I went down to London on Friday afternoon and met with her, and we had a very full discussion about all sorts of things that need to be addressed over the coming days and weeks.
When Mrs May spoke in Downing Street after she had gone to see the Queen, it was yet another robotic performance. It didn't even express any regret for the Tories who had lost. You had to intervene to get her to make a second statement, didn't you?
No, I don't. I've seen that reported. I don't think it's accurate. She was already going to give the interview that she gave shortly afterwards.
You urged her to do so.
She was already scheduled to give that interview. I happened to see her in between the statement and the interview, and certainly one of the things that I was keen to press home is that in the past I think the Conservative Party has been very poor in its communications with colleagues who've lost their seats at a general election. That's something that none of my colleagues likes to see. So I certainly did say that I think it's very important we do better this time.
What bits of the manifesto will you now have to junk for the Queen's speech in a week's time?
That is going to be a very interesting process to witness. I don't think it'll just be the Queen's speech. It's going to be the whole experience of government in the circumstances of minority government. There's no point in sailing ahead with items that were in the manifesto which we won't get through Parliament. So I think we're going to have to work very carefully. No doubt it will be a slimmed down Queen's speech, and we should concentrate on the things that really have to be done.
So tell me, which bits are you going to have to junk? A new social care policy, the back to the triple lock for pensioners, and no grammar schools. How about that?
Well, obviously, as you know, Andrew, I would be upset if we couldn't make any progress on allowing people to have the choice of grammar schools if they want it.
But are you prepared to drop it?
Well, of course, reality asserts itself. If we can't get things through Parliament, we can't do them. So, I certainly would suggest that we could look, for instance, at a rather modest sort of pilot, looking at opening some state grammar schools in inner urban areas, especially where education at the moment is not offering great opportunities to people of lower income backgrounds. I think that's something that would command quite broad support. I hear from friends on the Labour benches that quietly usually that they would quite like to see that kind of approach taken. So I hope we won't have to stop altogether, but certainly we're going to have to trim our policies carefully according to what we think Parliament will support.
Okay, Graham Brady in Salford, thanks for that. Let's now go to Nottingham, where I'm joined with the Conservative backbencher and Remain supporter Anna Soubry. Anna Soubry, in the early hours of Thursday morning, you called on Theresa May to, quote, consider her position. Is that still your view?
Oh, yes, and I think she obviously has considered her position, and I think she's set to go in due course, but I very much agree with Graham. We don't want her to go now. We want a period of stability, and she has got to reach out and she's got to form a consensus, and she's got to form a consensus in particular on Brexit. And she's now got to make sure that she understands that the British people have rejected a hard Brexit. We're leaving the EU. I don't think there's any change there. But we're not going to be leaving the EU in some irresponsible way that will damage our country and, of course, the future generations in our country. And there's a big lesson to be learnt, as you've already identified in your programme, about younger people and the message that they have clearly sent out in this election.
I'll come on to Brexit in a minute because it's very important, but you say she's set to go in due course. What does that mean?
So. I don't know. I don't know.
When? I mean, after the summer, before the end of the year?
I would have thought so.
Sometimes next year? When
I would
do you
have thought
think?
so. I don't know.
Before the end of the year?
I would have thought so. She's flawed. She's in a desperate situation. I think, I'm afraid, that her position is untenable. And I think she knows that. And I think she's doing the right thing, which is she's got rid of these special advisors. She's brought in Gavin Barwell. She's beginning to listen to people from all parts, not just of the party, but also the country. And she's got to reach out more. And she's got to broaden the base within her cabinet. And she's got to include people from all parts of my party, as well as all points of view across Parliament.
So what impact, in your view, will, as you describe it, Mrs May's much more weakened position, what impact will that have on her current Brexit stance? Will she have to change it, water it down?
Yes, absolutely. The country did not vote for a hard Brexit, and I think that this is obviously based on my experience of having knocked on literally thousands of doors, actually since February, because we've had county council elections in Rochdale. So I've listened to a lot of people. And the idea of a hard Brexit, the idea that no deal was better than a bad deal, I mean, people did not like that. This is one of the reasons we haven't won this election. And what they want, they accept that we're leaving. I accept we're leaving. But we now want to get the best deal, and she must not turn her back on British business, as I'm afraid she has. She has got to listen to British business. She's got to listen to Philip Hammond. She's got to listen to Greg Clark, wise owls who know what British business wants, and they want that single market. And they also want a proper immigration policy that recognises we need immigrants, we need free movement in order for British business to continue to flourish. She's got to at least listen to these things. I'm afraid she hasn't in the past.
Is that what Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, about the only leading Conservative to emerge on Thursday in an enhanced situation, is that what she means by an open Brexit? And would you support that? Is it your aim that we should remain members of the single market, that we should remain in the customs union, and that we put the economy before immigration. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, and I always have. And I have to tell you that in Broxtowe, in my literature, I made it very clear that I would continue to make the case for the single market and the positive benefits of immigration. And although my majority was reduced, I put on 1,800 more votes. Now, it's not about me, obviously, it's also about me being a Conservative, of course, but I did make my position clear, and I haven't faltered in that at all. This turning our back on the customs union in particular was the stuff of madness. And of course, the single market sees off the Nats and their desire for a second referendum, though of course the mighty Ruth Davidson has already done that with a remarkable result that she achieved in Scotland. But it would solve the problem in Ireland as well.
But don't you risk reopening all those Tory divisions over Europe on this? I mean, I understand your view, and you've held these views for a long time. There are plenty of other, probably more Tories that do want what you would call a hard Brexit.
Yeah,
they don't want to remain members of the single market. You're going to have, I mean, you've not got a majority, and you're now going to rip yourselves apart.
No, hang on a moment. Hang on a moment. It's this election. The people have spoken, and they have rejected the hard Brexit. I think we can all agree on that. That doesn't mean to say we're not leaving the EU. We are going to leave the EU. I do believe people, even people who voted Remain, now accept that we are leaving. I found very few angry Remainers on the doorsteps in Broxtowe, and we voted about 48–49% Remain. People accept the result, but they do not want a hard Brexit. That is the message that's coming out from this, and I hope Theresa gets that. And if she does, then she's got to build that consensus. There's nothing to stop her from working with sensible people in the Labour Party who also accept the referendum result, know that we are going to be leaving the EU, but we've got to get the best deal. We mustn't close our minds on the single market, the customs union and so on.
What other bits of the Tory manifesto are you now going to have to drop to keep your new bedfellows, the DUP, happy?
Well, I don't think we've actually reached any deal yet with the DUP.
But that's the aim.
Pardon?
That's the aim.
Yeah, well, apparently it's the aim. I'll tell you now, Andrew, you probably know far more than I know. I do know that, I get on very well with a number of members of the DUP. I don't like their policies on abortion, on women, on gay, lesbian, transgender issues at all. I completely disagree with them. But I think if everybody can set those differences aside and put the common interest in making a stable government, putting the national interest first, then there may well be a working arrangement so we can get through a budget, and we need a good budget, by the way, that's got to recognise many of the concerns that many people have had in this election about public services and about public sector pay, dare I say, as well. And we've got to recognise that, but at the same time, we've got to understand that we are going into choppy economic waters, and that's why I think it's so important that Theresa listens to Philip Hammond, and she puts him much more at the core and at the front of this government, because it's the economy that matters more than anything else. Okay. That's one of the spectacular failings of the campaign.
The economy was the issue that you hardly ever mentioned during the campaign.
Never mentioned it. Disgraceful.
Well, right, Anna Soubry, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for that.